And one thing that you might find useful is the ability to consolidate all of these strips and all of these clips into one new action so that you can then tweak them all at once. So let's show you how to do that. And just before we move on, make sure you save the file and then save it as something else, because what we're about to do could potentially lose some work. So we can continue later, make sure you save it first and then use a different file for this bit. Right, so once you've done that, choose the armature object, make sure you're not in pose mode, and then go Object, Animation, Bake Action, and we're going to do the object first because we want to bake the movement that the object is getting from that triangle. So we're going to say Clear Parent, that will make sure that the parent's animation is baked into the currently selected object, and we'll choose Visual Keying so that the transformations that get recorded are the same as the ones that we can see in the viewport. We don't need to worry about bones because we're only going to be doing the object at this point. In Blender 4, a little slight change is that we've now got the channels option at the bottom, and this just allows you to specify which properties you want to bake. So you can leave them all ticked because we want to bake all the data we've got. So we'll do OK, and that will create as a new action. I'll call this action baked, and this is just going to be for the movement of the triangle. So if I turn the triangle off now, go into its modifiers and disable that, the character will still walk around. Even if we delete the triangle, the character is still going to walk around because the triangle's movement has been baked in. Right, so the next thing we need to do is if we turn off the leaning and the walking, they're not going to be baked in yet. So we'll turn those back on. We'll select this. We need to go into pose mode this time. And we'll select all the bones, the ones that we've animated, and we'll say Pose, Animation, Bake Action. It's going to be in pose mode this time. And we can say only selected bones because the bones that aren't selected, the hidden ones, aren't animated anyway, so that's fine. Visual keying, very important. You need to make sure this is ticked. Otherwise, the effect of the constraints won't be baked into the animation. So your hands and things, or anything relying on IK, will be all over the place. So make sure you tick that. We won't say clear constraints because we want the ability to be able to use them in future if we decide that we don't want to continue using the baked action and we want to revert back to the ones below so that we can make modifications and then rebake. So we won't get rid of those, but if you did want to get rid of those, you could tick there. It would make the skeleton completely independent then of any sort of constraints, and in which case you'd probably want to untick only selected bones as well, just so that you bake the animation for everything in there. Now, very importantly, don't tick clear parents for bones for an armature, otherwise all your bones will no longer be parented, to each other. So moving the leg, for example, the upper leg, won't result in the lower leg moving along with it. So make sure that's unticked. And because we're wanting to combine this with the baked action that we've just made for the object, we need to make sure we choose overwrite current action. So tick that and it will combine the two together. So click OK. And there we go. So we can turn these off now and play this back. And now we've got all of that baked in and none of these actions are in use at all. And that gives us the ability, so let's say we come into the dope sheet now. We'll make sure we select all the bones that we've got animated. We go into object mode, and now we'll select the curve as well. And this, in the dope sheet, we'll be able to see all of the keyframes now for both the selected bones on the armature and the curve, so the bouncing of the curve. So select them all, press A, put the timeline to frame 1, the first frame of the animation, and then we can scale this. Now, before you do any scaling, turn off snapping. If you've got nearest frame snapping turned on, as soon as you start scaling these, let me just show you. So if I zoom in to here and start scaling out, you see they all change. We start getting little gaps like this down here because the keyframes, there's no frame where they land naturally, so they jump into the nearest one, and that's going to mess up the timing of the animation, make it really jerky. So just undo that. Turn off any snapping, so no auto snap, and then when I scale, it doesn't matter whether it lands exactly on the frame or not, it will always maintain the same relationship between keyframes. And that will allow us to just scale it and still get a perfectly smooth result. So for example, if I scale this up now to make it slower, And we're getting perfect result, no jerky behaviour because we've got no snapping turned on. It's just slower, and all the timing is maintained between the different actions because they're all now editable at once. And just to be thorough, I'll show you what happens when you do a full bake where you get rid of the constraints and some of the pitfalls that you might run into if you do that. It can come in handy, for example, if you've got a really complex constraint system, run by drivers and things, and it's really slowing your machine down, and you know for a fact that you're not going to be wanting to modify this anymore, then you can bake it all down, and that will improve performance during playback as well. It is a destructive operation, which I'll show you in a second, so make sure before you do this, save the blend file under a different name so that you don't lose the work you've already got. So we're going to turn these off to now, just to show you we're in the state where we've only got the triangles motion baked into the object, the armature object. We'll turn these back on. We'll go into pose mode. Doesn't matter what you've got selected. We'll go pose, animation, bake action, visual keying so we get the result of those constraints, and then we'll clear the constraints as well. Overwrite current action so we don't lose the baked data we've just created for the object itself, so it's going to combine the two into one action. And then make sure we untick only selected bones because we need to bake all the bones regardless of whether they're selected or visible. Okay. And that's now combine those in. So if I turn these off, play this back, we've got the full animation. And if we look at the all the bones we've got in pose mode, you see we've no longer got those constraints. So all the IK constraints and things have gone. Now this can be problematic if, for example, you decide, I've made a mistake with this action, I want to go back to these now. So let's push this one down, and we'll turn it off, and then we'll turn these two on. You'll notice because those constraints have gone, we can no longer sort of get the result we want. We've only animated the hands and the feet. So all the bones here are no longer going to be controlled by those constraints, basically. And that's only if we're using the old action. If we're using the current action, obviously, that we just baked, then everything's going to be fine. And if you want to scale this, we can do the same as we did before. So just go into pose mode, make sure you've got all of the bones selected. And in order to select them all, of course, you need to make sure they're visible. So in Blender 3.63, just use the layers to turn on all the bones so that you can select them all. Or in Blender 4, turn them all on by using the eyeballs in the bone collections. So with all bones selected, back out of pose mode into object mode so we can also select the curve. So shift click this, and now we can select all the keyframes again and scale the animation if we want to. But the problem is, if we look in the dope sheet, we can't see the keyframes for the robot because we've pushed the robot's action down into its own baked track. So the keyframes for this aren't going to be visible unless we go into tweak mode. So into tab, press tab, and now we should be able to see these in here. So select them all with A, and then we can scale those down now to change the speed and keep all the timing perfectly in sync. And an alternative method, if ever you want to get the baked track back onto the live track to do the same thing without going into tweak mode, is turn off this track. So now nothing's happening. And we'll go to the live action here, and we'll just say use that track that we've baked, which was called action in my case. And now we don't need to go into tweak mode because it's back on the live track, so we'll be able to see them all in here again. So next up, we'll move on to some FK and IK switching, which is really useful for things like where you want to interact with other objects.